this special creative conversations outside of the usual schedule, but we're really delighted to have as our guest Roderick Watson, the author of The Silver Gold Mirrors, a poetry collection which this event is in honour of, and also Professor Alan Riach from the University of Glasgow, I'm sure many of you know. And the conversation after some poetry, I believe, is going to also turn to Neil Gunn in relation to this, The Grey Coast. So it's really a privilege to do this event in collaboration with the University of Dundee, and thank you so much, Gail Lowe, for your input on organising it. So please welcome Roderick Watson and Alan Riach.
Thank you very much, Colin, and thanks for setting this up under the aegis of Creative Conversations. And Louise is here. The creative writing operation in Glasgow University is one of the showcase units, as you like, if you like, in the university, and to be working in collaboration from Scottish literature, as you say, with Dundee, but also as an emeritus professor at Stirling. So we're actually having a kind of collective jamboree of specialisms and pleasures here. As Colin said, we've got two things essentially to focus on here. The primary one is Rory's new book of poems called The Silver of Gold Mirrors. I'll say something about that in a moment, but just to give you an outline, we will come back or move on, expand the conversation really, to Neil Gunn's very first novel called The Grey Coast, which appeared in 1926, so it's the centenary of its publication and of the initiation that Neil Gunn created with this book. And I want to come back to that, and what I think will steer the conversation towards, in a way, if we go in that direction, is this relationship that Rory and I both have as university professors, as university teachers, and scholars and critics and literary historians, and also as creative writers, as poets, and the relationship between those two activities, which is sometimes perhaps very fruitful and productive, and sometimes perhaps a little vexed. And misunderstood. Misunderstood. And troublesome, maybe, but we can come back to that. I want to say, to begin with, really, that Rory is an old friend, as well as a professional colleague of, I think, the highest standing. I think he is one of the most well-loved, or certainly, I was going to say, I wrote in a description saying one of the most well-liked of all university professors, and certainly all university professors of Scottish literature. And I was thinking about that, and I suppose the cliche in a blurb would be to say well-loved. It's true, but well-liked, I think, is probably a more difficult thing to earn. If you're liked and respected in such ways as Rory is and has been for many decades. I think we met first in the 1980s, perhaps, a long time ago. And I remember being in what was the Third Eye Centre in Solihull Street in Glasgow, not long before I left to go to New Zealand in 1986. But it was before that I remember looking over and glancing at the bookshelves in the Third Eye Centre's shop, and seeing the spine of this book and picking it up for the very first time, the first edition of the Literature of Scotland, one-volume edition, from I think 1984, five, thereabouts, just before I left. It was a breakthrough volume of its own kind. And since then it's been reprinted as the Literature of Scotland in two volumes. So there's the expansion, the incremental expansion of the subject, and the other histories of literature, of Scottish literature, and the literature of Scotland, so to speak, have also multiplied in number and in variety of perspective. So we're in a kind of context where Edwin Morgan once wrote a poem for the Association for Scottish Literary Studies in praise of their activities and work, and the two words that he used there was retrieving and renewing. Those two words were retrieving and renewing. And that sense of going back into history to retrieve the tradition, as it were, or to see it afresh, but also to renew it with new work and new original new work in terms of poetry and creative work, creative writing. I think this is what we've both, to some extent, been committed to over our professional working lives, and in a personal way in terms of just simply being poets. So I think the best thing I can do, without further ado, is to invite Rory himself to open the session up by reading one or two or three poems from the new book, and maybe say a few words about it, but I'll hand it over to you to start.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us to talk today. This is a poem I tend to open this collection with. It's a kind of credo poem. I find the world on the whole a beautiful place and a very disturbing place in almost equal proportions. So this is my paradisial poem, but there are kind of slightly dark vibrations in there. It's called In the Park. I'm lying on my back in the grass as the sun sets on a park in France. The stage is rocking to amplified thunder and the rooks are flying home. Down here it's dark because twilight has come, though the sky is clear as the birds return, roosting in trees all around us. It's like that Magritte painting, The Empire of Light, bathed in thunder and shadow as the music booms and the trees creak to the never-ending conference of the rooks. The stage in the distance is all smoke and glare. Dogs and children float on waves of sound. A helicopter beats overhead like some war movie. And miles above, a contrail shines, a golden seam stitching the world with the sun's last rays. People are always going somewhere, but down here we're dancing in rings or lying in the scent of grass. Down here the rooks make their own music, stacked and ranked in the shadow of the trees. In this particular dusk, it all seems to fit. The heat of the day just past, the rooks tracking in the air, the racket in the branches, the failing glow, the weight and joy of the spinning place, the drums and the bass. A sudden delight at the end of it all. Empire of Light. Yeah. You may know the painting, it's a fun, fabulous painting by Magritte. Yeah. I was going to say something about it, I can't quite remember what it was. Yeah. This is called Old News. I live in Stirling in Riverside, and the river does a huge loop, the River Forth does a huge loop around the bit of Stirling that we live in. So the river flows at each end of our street, and it's tidal. So twice a day the river flows backwards, which is a gift. I mean, just a metaphorical freebie. And this is about history. This is about trying to live in history. Across the river from us is Kenneth Abbey. Just up the hill is the Great Hall of Stirling Castle. Along the river is the Old Stirling Bridge for the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Further up the hill is the Battle of Bannockburn. We're surrounded by history and surrounded by particularly bloody history. And there's an epigraph to this poem, which is the 4th at Stirling, the shores of the Mediterranean, November 2015. And the reference there is, it's one of the very early moments of refugees coming from North Africa heading for Europe. And you may remember that winter there were horrendous photographs of children washed up on the beach in Italy who had been lost at sea trying to find Europe. So that's the reference there. Yeah. Old News. It's how we can live in the middle of all this, really. Our street is wide and a river runs around it. We live in the loop and watch the tide flowing upstream as the years draw in. There was a harbour here, now just timbers in the mud. I put the newspapers out each week and lock the door. The castle hall is golden on the hill. Beneath its walls, Sir Hugh de Cressingham was skinned to make a sword belt for the nation's hero. There were brickworks here not so long ago, and a ferry to the peaceful abbey where armies came to bleed and struggle on the shore. Our lines and borders have moved elsewhere. Everything sinks and rises under our feet, but nothing changes. Digging in the garden the other day, a perfect brick turned up. Back again. Like those drowned bodies on another beach, not to be denied on television, helplessly seen and far away. In this low light, our shadows reach across to the other bank. They seem friendly, but do not follow when we turn aside. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, okay.
Wow.
That's old news. Yeah. Will I do one more?
Do one more,
Okay.
please.
This is the title poem, Silver of Old Mirrors. It's a kind of love poem with furniture. You may know how float glass is made. Molten glass is floated over a huge tray of molten tin. So I love old mirrors, the very thick glass, the beveled edges, slightly foxed, slightly faded, and the publishers have picked up some of that foxing in this book, if you look at the pages. It's an astonishing mixture of coolness and heat, really. That's what struck me. It's another gift of a metaphor, really. The silver of old mirrors. The silver of old mirrors, slightly foxed, with float glass made on a molten pool of tin, holds us tightly locked in its cool embrace. Touch your finger to the surface and reach, it will always be half an inch away from such likeness, and always other to the one you are. This is as close as we get, brightly boxed in the moment. The mahogany frame, the finger, your face, so much old furniture to keep, to remember, to lose. So this is what I'm thinking in the freezing gloom of a storehouse in Auchterarder as we wander past dressing tables and sepulchral wardrobes with an air of mothballs and missing clothes. I see anew the lines around your eyes, faintly laced, and my own pale face, and want to reach and touch the reflection of your cheek, to recall its silver ghost, that time in Savannah, the darkened room, the molten pool of tin.
These are wonderful poems, and the book, I think, is a wonderful book. It's a book that reflects very openly, directly and honestly, I think, about ageing and about the matter of being more senior than one once was. It's the third book, isn't it?
It's the third collection.
The first
the
collection
slimmest collection
was True History on the Walls.
True History on the Walls.
And the second, that was MacDonald, and the second one was
Flew a Crest, and it was Into the Blue Wavelengths.
Wavelengths.
Yeah.
And I remember that phrase because it's a phrase that comes, I think, from your elegy for McDermott, about the wavelengths and the tuning in to McDermott's voice, as it were.
We share McDermott.
That's another point of sharing, indeed. Come to that as well in a moment. But the sense that this book is a kind of advance on the earlier books, because it's meditative in a way that the earlier ones...
It didn't occur to me, but since I've been reading from it and hearing what people say, I think you're right. It's strange. True History the poems were dense, long lines. It was a young man's writing, really, and kind of full of rage and anger too, I think, as well as tenderness. Yeah. Into the Blue, True History, the prevailing image of that was graffiti, marks left by time and history. That's a constant for me. I just keep coming back to that. So graffiti on the walls. I was living in Edinburgh at the time, and the marks left on ourselves by experience and time and that kind of thing. And there are quite a lot of poems about the war, about memories of the Second War, damage done by the war in that collection. And then the prevailing image in Blue Wavelengths was recorded music, radio broadcasts. The poem you were remembering is an astonishing moment I had. I was a hi-fi buff at one time, and I used to have a stereo system, and I was listening to the radio on stereo, and McDermott had died not so long before, and there was a memorial thing to McDermott, and all of a sudden, there was, we both knew him really quite well, there was his voice in stereo in my living room. It was absolutely eerie, and that poem was born out of that. So that was the prevailing thing there. At least one reviewer, you were talking about age, said, these are late poems. And I thought, no, bugger that, I'm not finished yet. But yes, they've become much more personal, much more conversational, much lower key.
Yeah, I like that. It's a condition I aspire to. It's not. I think that the idea that a late era of writing is a diminishment is wrong.
I hope so.
I'm certain of it. I mean, it's just to recommend it. I want to come back in a moment to this. There's a book I read quite recently by a critic called Nicholas Allen called Late Heaney.
Oh, yeah.
And it's his book about reading books that Heaney wrote after the Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
But he's reading them in Belfast as a young man, as a boy, as a student growing up.
Yeah.
So it's a mixture of scholarly analysis of Heaney's late work, but also kind of autobiographical sense of how does the critic and the poet, or Nicholas isn't a poet, but he's very sensitive to the work that's going on there, in very personal ways. So it's almost an autobiographical account as well. And I get the sense from this book that there's this elision of critical intelligence, personal memory, and a kind of, I was going to say, a phrase might be a seniority of judgment that isn't judgment, a seniority of appraisal that's more about evaluation. Does that make sense?
I hope so. Yeah. I used to think I was a crunchy modernist, I come to realise I'm actually a romantic.
Yeah.
So I used personal experience, memory, and engagement with history in the past and so on. It's not just autobiographical. It may look autobiographical. It doesn't mean to be. It doesn't seem to me to be. I'm trying to use that material to say something deeper, to say something further. I mean, the in the park poem, it's in a sense it's descriptive. I was in a park in France, in Nantes, but I'm trying to. The way of painting will say more than just a jug of flowers. That wonderful McCabe poem about a still life.
Just the one called
exploding, flowers.
Yes,
and so on.
indeed.
So I'm trying to use that personal experience to say something a bit deeper about what it is to be alive and to have to deal with where we all are.
You just prompted another memory of a McCaig poem. I think it's called The Blue Jar.
Yes.
Is it The Blue Jar?
Yes.
And it's about
throbbing in the canvas.
canvas. And then there's one now, if I'm remembering correctly, he says, events come bringing me presents. He tries to be the careful custodian of the ones he doesn't like.
Yeah.
And he puts the ugly mask behind the jar, but the face of this ugly mask moves through the jar to the front.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful image.
Yeah.
You cannot erase those aspects of it that you're talking about that are kind of universal as well as.
So the personal engagement in these and earlier poems too is really just a way of finding a way to talk about something that is bothering me at a deeper level, really, I suppose. I
So there's still an element of anger in there.
I hope so. I hope so. Yeah.
Is there a sense that kind of has an endorsement from McDermott?
Yeah, well, you and me and McDermott go back a long way.
Yeah.
I was, well, I mean, too much autobiography perhaps. I was, when you know the Burns competition to read Scottish poems, usually Burns at school, when that came to me in school, I did the early Scots lyrics, a couple of the early Scots lyrics.
McDermott.
Yes, and my father knew McDermott, so I knew about McDermott at an abnormally young age, really, for that reason. But it was mid-late McDermott that really got me going, particularly a poem called Crystals Like Blood.
Yeah.
It's that prosy, long line, prosy McDermott, and Crystals Like Blood just spoke to me. I just thought that, and so my early poetry was quite clearly, I think, influenced by that way of writing. Long lines, heavyweight, lots of material, lots of stuff, lots of information. So it was that McDermott really set me going as a writer rather than the early lyrics.
That's fascinating. Me, not the same, but similar. I remember being knocked out from the very first moment I read A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle, but then also reading In Memoriam James Joyce,
Yes.
being knocked out in a totally different way.
Yes.
And you remember reading Drunk Man and thinking, this is the language of my parents, my uncles and aunts, my cousins.
Yeah.
I'd never seen it, and it's dealing with sexuality, it's dealing with politics, it's dealing with adult things, but I've never seen it on a page do this before.
Yeah.
And it's, you know how sometimes you read sometimes I get it from Shakespeare, but you get it, sometimes great writing does this. The words seem to move on the page and arrest you and go in. And there was that. But then with the Joyce poem, and it's much closer in a way to Crystals Like Blood.
And On a Raised Beach.
And On a Raised Beach.
You know, a line like, there are plenty of ruined buildings in the world, but no ruined stones. And I think, yes.
And it stays.
Yes.
That exhilaration of reading the Joyce poem with so many of a multitude of references that you know in no single life could encompass all this. But why not give it a try? I mean, give it a whirl. There's a kind of exhilaration about that as well. We're touching on this kind of overlap between scholarship, if you like, and poetry. Maybe one thing I might ask you to do, if you would, as a further way in, is the poem called Noli Timere,
Oh yeah.
which I particularly love in your collection, because it links with something I've just recently written, and I'd like to sort of bring this into the discussion. So, could you read that one for us?
Sure. It touches on something we were mentioning just a moment ago, really. Noli Timere, Latin for "be not afraid," is said to be Seamus Heaney's last words. And we were lucky to have Seamus visit Stirling on a number of occasions, various conferences and stuff and readings. So we got to know him quite well, really. My good friend Alistair McRae is a particularly close friend of Seamus's. So we got to hang out with him a little bit. And he was just a remarkable person. And this was written in the aftermath of his death, I guess, really. It's about time, memory. Noli Timere. So this is it, and here we all are. I wake up thinking of that man, the breadth and depth of him, and the message he left at the border, going to the big place where we walk with everyone. Up in Skye, my mother turns another card, looking out to Ben Scriel in her long game of patience. She is waiting for the court cards, the knaves and queens. Sometimes it works out, and sometimes not. Like the historical novels in her favourite bookcase by the window, where they rest under a film of dust as the island evening draws to a close and the faces turn up one by one. Sisters and brothers, the church choir, the old folks in their cold water kitchen, the children, and then the great-grandchildren that neither she nor I will see, as the last lines turn out in a turn of the cards. On the shore below, Knock Castle is fading into the turf and boulders of a holy natural world. It is time alone at work, nothing else. So much to say unsaid. There's a gate back down the road with two boys in shorts and ragged jerseys, guddling heedless in weed-rich ditches. One of them was me.
I have an ulterior motive for asking you to quote that. I've got a new book coming out later this year, and there's one poem that picks up on Seamus Heaney's poems, the poems that Heaney himself wrote to, or addressed to MacDiarmid, and in memoriam Norman McCaig, Ian Crichton-Smith, George Mackay-Brown. Heaney himself seemed to have a real respect and love, indeed, and affinity for the Scottish poets.
Yes.
And that was very much reciprocated, I think, especially by Ian Crichton-Smith, who recognised not only Heaney but other Irish poets, and a kind of commerce of understanding between them.
Scottish poets would go tours in Ireland and vice versa.
Back in the days when
famously boozy tours, but
famously busy, but also really productive.
Yes,
And financed by the Arts Council as it was then, the days when such things were
God
being
bless
done.
it.
There seems to be less investment in such intellectual commerce these days, and for what it's worth, we oppose it. We want more of that to happen, even if it only happens in such things as these. Poems. Heaney's poem addressed to MacDiarmid asks MacDiarmid to incline to him, to not to gesticulate, but to move towards him, to talk to him, to address him from Shetland. And I was in Shetland in a month or so ago, and this stayed in my mind. So this is the poem to Shetland. Would they had stayed, he wrote, but they never do, and could not if they wished to, but inclined, aye, yes, they all did that. From Shetland's stony edges, bright waterways, the straths and voes, across the churn of sea, to grass-smoothed Orkney, arced around the northwest mainland corner there, Loch Inver, out to Lewis, south to Rasay, Skye. That comfort of geography, leaning down to reach him there in Ireland. Don't go, he might have said, but they always do. And all we do is call them back in this, the peopled silence of the ghosts and riverbanks, coastlines, shores, along the archipelagos of distance. He called them towards himself, and they inclined in generosity. Chris, George, Norman, Ian, sorry. Now I call them quietly, not to come out, but stay there, in their locations, so that I can travel towards them once again, incline myself to west and north and further north. No turning back from this, the compass point, the destination still assured. Yes, I think in the poems that you've read and in the kind of thing I'm gesturing towards, there is a kind of conversational spirit, a kind of commerce of language, of acknowledgement of others, and a welcoming.
Yeah. Particularly in Into the Blue Wavelengths, I've written elegies to. We were lucky. We were the last generation really to be old enough to live and mix with the great figures of the second wave of the Scottish literary Renaissance, the poets. Norman taught at Stirling for 8 years and was a really good friend. And I got to read in the Heretics in the 70s in Edinburgh. We lived in Edinburgh for 2 years with more or less all of them. I mean, it was just astonishing. And so I've written an elegy for Sidney Goodson-Smith. I've written several poems to MacDiarmid, 2 poems to McCaig. I've written an elegy for Eddie Morgan, who I also was lucky to know and do readings with in the days when poetry readings were a bit more popular or more funded, I guess, is really what we're talking about. So they moved me a lot, and there's a sense in which my elegies are suffused with their own poetry. There's a kind of, there are images in these poems that have to do with things that they themselves wrote. So it's a kind of homage.
Yeah, yeah. Having said that, I think there's an originality about your own work. It's not like others. I think one of the things that McDermott insisted upon was that he didn't want any disciples. Nobody should write. Nobody should write like him. If you do, it's not going to work. And in fact, if you think of all of the guys that we've mentioned, and all men, but we could extend that a wee bit, I suppose, into a more recent generation where women, the voices of women, the experiences and judgments of women come to add that a dimension that in a way required what Edwin Morgan called a retrieving and a renewal from an earlier generation, which is part of the history of the patriarchy, but it hopefully is changing to that extent. However, that sense of all of those guys being so individuated, McCaig, nobody writes like McCaig, but anybody writing in English can learn from him. Crichton Smith, George Mackay Brown, they're all kind of perfectionists in one way or another, hit or miss sometimes, but looking for it. And that sense of a company that we have been among in that generation.
And you're right. I mean, the astonishing thing, just at the end of that generation was largely, as you say, men. But what follows immediately afterwards, an absolute explosion of women writing good poetry in Scotland. I mean, that, Liz Lockett is an early signal, really, of that. And you can go back historically and find Nan Shepherd and,
yes,
and Marian Angus and so on, no problem. But the explosion of women writing creatively in Scotland, both in prose and poetry, is very notable and hugely encouraging.
Yeah, it's a redress that had to happen, and
because the Rose Street Bunch were pretty macho,
Having said that, I remember Sandy Moffat telling me about the Rose Street Bunch and saying actually there's a kind of stigma attaches to Millen's Bar as being a place of toxic masculinity. And Sandy's take on this was rather different. He said, no, it wasn't. It was a place where ideas were being talked about all the time. Poetry, if you were brave enough to talk about it, you could have the conversation. If you went down the road to another pub or different pubs where it was all retired military people, there was no shortage of toxic masculinity in certain other places. But the kind of fierce male, but an energy that was there that was actually open to intervention, to discussion, and to change, was something which I think all of those poets that we mentioned were wanting to encourage. And I guess that should, what I'd probably like to do in a moment is open it up to questions or any comments that anybody might have. But I want to just touch on the Neil Gunn publication as well. We mentioned, Rory and I both have been, or are, lecturers, professors, teachers, so we're still effectively professors of the subject. And Neil Gunn's centenary for this first of his novels, The Great Coast, is this year, the same as the centenary as it is for Hugh McDermott's Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle. So this is a kind of auspicious event. So with a marvellous, I love the fact that this is it's a very handsome hardback edition, but it's so light to hold, and you can actually read it. The print isn't too small. So I've written the introduction to this new edition of The Grey Coast, his first novel. I've got about three copies with me. £15 available today for 10, and I think the Silver of Old Mirrors, there's copies there available at the end of the session as well. But I want to ask Rory to maybe comment on this as a professor of Scottish literature, or an emeritus professor of Scottish literature. Neil Gunn is again in the constellation of the canon. He's one of the great writers who, in a sense, is maybe a bit neglected now.
Yeah. And, latterly, I mean, even in his own time, possibly didn't get as much critical attention as he deserved. Yeah. We republished Neil Gunn. I was series editor of the Canongate Classics, which was funded by the Blessed Arts Council. to reprint long forgotten or too much forgotten Scottish books and authors and poets. And John Pick, who is a colleague on the board there, was very keen on Neil Gunn. And he had played a big part in bringing some of the crucial Gunn books back into the light. But we were talking just when we came in about the Great Coast as a kind of milestone of a particular what harbinger, a stormy petrel ahead of its time, simply looking at the despair of Scotland, really, in the 20s and into the 30s, of course. And it was one of the earliest books dealing with a kind of existential, social, political wasteland, really.
Can you imagine, what would you think it might be like now to be reading it for the first time?
I don't know. It depends, I suppose, how much Scottish literature you've read, because some of it might seem quite familiar, although in a sense it's 10 years ahead of the books that you become used to. So
that's so in a way it's a harbinger.
But you were saying it was also slow.
Yeah, it's very slow.
And it's not a contemporary book, and it's not a rattling good read in that sense.
It's one of those books, I think, where you have to make up your mind that you're going to read it. It's not, you can't skim it, and you can't expect it to go faster than it does. But having said that, it sort of reminds you of, I say here in the introduction, the structure is that of a whirlpool, a vortex of currents moving very slowly, then gathering speed towards an encroaching confrontation. And at the end, the climax of the whole novel is very, very fast. And it's over before you know it. But what struck me rereading it for this edition was that it's the relationship between the external world and the internal world that he gets so uniquely. This is a landscape populated, an economic world, the fishing, the crofting, the generational world from the older men and the fishermen and the women who live here, and the gendered activities that are part of the economy that people cannot get out of, that they are prisoners within. And yet at the same time they are agencies, they are actually taking their own fate into their own hands. Not least, in fact most of all, the young woman who's at the centre of the novel. And there are two passages, just briefly. She withdrew quietly, closing the door behind her, stood looking forth unseeingly on that great sweep of rock-bound seaboard that stretched from her feet to the far distant brooding headland, which always gave the impression of a head crouching upon the sea, the line of the backbone running inland against the sky, culminating in the mountain edge like a series of vast spinal dislocations. And then if you come indoors with her, Maggie places her uncle's dinner, a plate of steaming fish upon the table, and there's an exchange between them and how their eyes look at each other. For the first time that night, her eyes met her uncle's directly, met them and did not waver, while plainly the lash of colour in her face boded words that might be better left unsaid. Her uncle's eyes shifted to his fish, of which he lifted a succulent piece with his fingers, drawing it into his mouth with a noisy suction. From that sound, Maggie turned away, and there was silence between them. And it's just that sense that Gunn gets, this brilliant sense of a vista of a landscape and a seascape, and then almost a kind of the physical intimacy of the detail of eating his fishes there is singular writing.
He has an astonishing eye. He has an eye for the kind of epiphanic moment. John Pick was keen on this, and John Burns wrote a book about Zen and Neil Gunn. And Zen, when I was an undergraduate, like we all were when we were undergraduates, much engaged with Zen Buddhism, and he has an eye for the epiphanic moment, the transparency of water in a well, the single moment where a cloud moves just such a way and so on. Yeah. He has an astonishing eye for that, amazing. And it's a kind of poet's eye in a way, which is counter really to the kind of social grimness in so many of his novels.
And yet, it's also, you're right, I think, to say it's a poet's eye, but it's a very singular capacity of his work as a novelist, that these moments are contained within the novel as a larger narrative.
Yeah.
And he doesn't make a poem out of them. In fact, there's one, just to that illustration, the one called The Well at the World's End.
Yeah.
I made the first chapter into a poem, a found poem.
Yeah.
And it's just the story of the main character visiting, he sees the old lady in the garden, and she says the well is just down the road there. And he goes down, he looks into it, and there's no water. And he goes back and says, there's no water in the well. And the old lady says, well, there's always water in the well. And he goes back through the forest to the well again. And he says, there's a great phrase, he's looking at the pebbles, but the pebbles in a well like that always retain the memory of water. But there's no water. And then he puts his hand down, and his hand goes into the water. It's just a magical moment.
Yeah, it's just
And
fantastic.
thankfully, I was very self-conscious about this. I think it's a good poem, but it's Gunn's words. So Dermot Gunn, his nephew, I thought I must do the honest thing, and cards on the table, is this all right with you? And he said, it's great, just take it, it's fabulous. Neil would have loved it.
A fun poem, yeah.
It's a found poem, but it also hopefully directs you back towards Neil Gunn and the context of that within the novel.
Talking about his reputation, I've always thought it's a great shame that the Well at the World's the Green Valley,
The Green Isle of the Great
Green
Deep.
Isle of the Great Deep. Well at the World's End. The Green Isle of the Great Deep isn't better known in the company of 1984 and Brave New World. It's one of the great dystopian novels of that period, and it should be talked about in exactly the same terms. And the three very different takes on where we're all going wrong, really.
Yeah. The difference, I think, is that Neil Gunn has an answer.
Well, the Green Isle is actually about managerialism,
Yes.
which turns out to be particularly pertinent
Yes.
and relevant today. You know, we know about Big Brother is watching you, and we know about Soma and drugs and all the rest of it. But perhaps the real curse, you know, the famous Scottish poet, I'll give you a modern curse, read tape. Managerialism is a modern
curse.
disease. Yeah.
Yes, bureaucracy, bureaucrats, administration. I know many administrators who are very, very nice people, and yet they seem to, their jobs seem to be to create administration. It's a very strange paradox, and it is a curse. But yeah, I mean, the Green Isle of the Great Deep also has an answer that Orwell or Huxley don't have, which is, let me get this right now, the hazelnut of knowledge, or the salmon of wisdom.
Wisdom, yeah.
And this is Gaelic, but coming into an Anglophone world of the novel. Are there particular perhaps comments, or we're now nearly 10:02, and we promised that we would stop promptly at 2, and I've asked Rory to think of a couple of poems to end with, but perhaps we could open it up for 5 or 10 minutes if anybody has particular comments or questions that you'd like to make. Yeah, thank you.
You mentioned Edwin Morgan and all that.
So you're going to have to speak up. I'm deaf, among other
So,
things.
is that loud enough?
Yeah.
You mentioned Edwin Morgan a number of times, understandably, and it was funny timing because I read today that today would have been his 106th birthday.
Oh, gosh, 106.
A number of dedications or in memoriams that were posted about him, including Ian Crichton-Smith. It was interesting you spoke about writing a number of them yourself for various people. I thought it was interesting also how you spoke about it being an homage. Does it change for you when you're writing for someone or to someone, does it change the process of writing to something or to someone as opposed to from something within yourself?
I don't think so. It comes from somewhere. It's coming from somewhere in much the same way. It may be, Park in France. It may be attending Eddie Morgan's funeral in Glasgow, and the wonderful moment when what's his name plays the sax.
Tommy Smith.
Tommy Smith takes the sax out and blows the cobwebs out of the place.
Yeah.
I mean, that was magical and astonishing. So you know, it's things like that that stick with you, that become the seed, really, for whatever it is. So I'm not aware of a kind of commission or a requirement to write like that. I'm just working in the way I normally work with whatever it is that's caught my attention or laid a seed.
There are these prompts.
Yeah. Sometimes the poem will come to you. The moment that will generate the poem was maybe 5 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, so.
But thanks for reminding us that this 106th birthday. That's worth noting.
One of the poems in Blue Wavelengths I'm proud of is one that Eddie himself particularly liked. It was one of the key moments in that was the Voyager spacecraft going off into space with a gold disc tacked onto its side, including Johnny Be Good, your rock and roll song. Yeah, I mean, that was, you don't want to miss that, and that's a gift.
You've got to have that on the record.
Could I ask
Yeah,
a question? I mean, it's lovely to hear it again. I've worked with this collection, having published it with Kirsty. I was quite struck again, I think, kind of, you're reading the Silver Foil Mirrors, and then the other poem I loved so much was Coda at the end, because you draw attention to words rather than simply kind of going through the picture into the moment itself. It's also about the community of writers, it's also about painting, it's also about music, other kinds of forms. So there is a kind of, I suppose there's attentiveness to its form and the thinness of words, the thinginess of words. So when you end that poem, it's kind of a beautiful coda to the whole collection. I wondered how much, I know we've had the discussion when we actually put the book together about mirrors, but I wondered how much that whole sense of not always having a slight wrinkle to draw your reader's attention to the fact that this is representational, this is words, this is the creation of words.
Yeah, I feel that quite strongly. I find there's I might be careful here because I'm going to sound like just an old fart, but there's a tendency in what is what is passing in popular terms as poetry that has no engagement with language at all. It's just simply saying things. There's no grit, you know. Doesn't seem to be much joy in language in there, and I regret that. It's fine. It's a different kind of writing, different kind of performance. I've no problems with that. But for me, poetry has to have. You have to recognise that the tools you're working with, really, and the resistance they have, and the difficulties they have. The true history on the walls is full of clunky words, and early McDermott, you know, the middle Macdermot I'm talking about, is full of gritty language like that, and I think I like that. I mean, I just like it. It's a personal choice, not for everyone. But
I think there are two, I've always said this, there are like two reasons for reading poems or following a poet's work. And they're not the same thing, but they overlap. They're almost the same thing. One is the poet's mind. Where's the poet's mind taking you? And what's the intelligence, what's the information that comes through just by reading this stuff? And the other is the poet's language. And they're both the same thing in a way, but they're not quite the same. They're different things at the same time. And I think this is partly the thing is, if you don't have language that has this, you use the word grit or some kind of granular reality, an intrinsic vulnerability even, because it's alive. Words of a poem should move, must move. Then the mind doesn't work. If it's inert, the mind isn't working.
I think poetry should resist the understanding a little bit at least.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't resist the understanding, it's not really working, and you're not really working. It's an engagement. There's a sense in which the act of reading is a creative act. There's no question about that. And you have to give something of yourself to it. And if you do that, the poem will give you something back.
I'm afraid this is what I tell all my first year students. I'm here to say things that you won't understand. to begin with, but then later on you'll know more than I will. You know, it's like that. It's a test in a way of your own capacity, but also of the reader's investment and generosity that you reciprocate with. And I was involved in an exercise in the Polytechnic University of Macau a couple of months ago, translating one of my poems into Chinese, and a Chinese poet's poem through various translations that I would make into a poem. And the various ways in which this was, the Chinese poem was incomprehensible to me to begin with, obviously. The poet was there and could read it, so I heard it, but the music of it, I couldn't emulate that at all. But the intervening texts were all AI generated. And once you're spending 5 hours working like this on this one short poem, you actually get very, very close to how the language works. And what we found was that the language of the AI generated text, there were 3 of the same poem. One was literal, one was poetic, in quotation marks, and the third was metrical. And the metrical one was completely outrageously crazy and daft. The poetic one was so artificial that you could knock it over with a breath. And the literal one was kind of helpful in a sense, but the language of all 3 was inert. It was dead. And when we're working on it to translate it, this is what you're working towards, and you can't make it. You can't manufacture it. It becomes possible when the phrases or the rhythms or the language takes its own shape. And if it works as a poem, then the language itself is vulnerable. It's open to interpretation, it's open to reading, and it's open to, it can be made fun of. It can be it's object of satire, but then it can also be the object of respect and sympathy and understanding. It's alive in a different way. I think that's the answer.
I may have overcooked it here and there. Guddling, heedless, and weed-rich ditches. I think I took a risk with that one.
We're coming towards an end. If there's no other questions or comments.
Very quick one for
Colin.
Zoom, which is, how do you think the emergence of creative writing on the university curriculum has affected study and production of Scottish literature? Maybe just before the...
Well, I have mixed feelings about that. I've been involved with taking students through the experience of creative writing at Stirling, and I think we started it as an undergraduate possibility, so that for one of their essays in the poetry course, they could actually write something, or on the short story course as well. Write a short story, rewrite this short story from the point of view of another person in it, stuff like that. I think it's a fantastically powerful educational tool that students begin to see how language works, they begin to appreciate how this particular writer operates and so on. And it's a tremendously powerful critical tool. So I have no doubt in my mind that a creative engagement of that sort is an important part of education. The professionalisation of creative writing, so to speak, and the professionalisation of creative writing courses, I have mixed feelings about. Very complicated feelings about that. Some extraordinarily fine writers have come out of these courses, but I'm not quite sure. There are worries in academic circles that creative writing courses are producing the same kinds of output, basically. And there is that. The same thing with jazz, that modern jazz, teaching of modern jazz in American colleges is producing exactly the same kind of music all the time. And you have to look back to some of the old heroes to see something that was genuinely more striking, more unusual. But that's a private thing on my part. That's a private worry on my part. But the student engagement with creative writing, I think, is really important. But it should also be part of the study, I think, is.
Yeah. Just to briefly back that up, my view is that reservations are there. It's so wrong to imagine that you can teach anybody to be a writer if they write like you. You know, it's like what I was saying about McDermott not wanting disciples. You just do not want to be emulated in that way.
Yeah.
It's not to say that people can't learn, and therefore reading is obviously the most crucial thing. But the one thing that I think is incontrovertibly good about the creative writing operations that go on, almost everywhere, I think, is that insofar as it allows anybody an opportunity and time to bring along a piece of their own writing and to have it looked at by others who are going to be critical but sympathetic, who are going to be appraising but also understanding that you are putting yourself in a position of extreme vulnerability. And by that token, you are in a place where your life really does matter. And I remember teaching some creative writing to people in a Workers' Education Association operation years ago now, on the outskirts of Glasgow. And it was a bunch of about half a dozen people, and they said, "This is so valuable. I have never had. I'm writing about my experience. You're giving a critique of my writing, but we're also talking about what I'm doing to put it into words. And this is the place where I've had most value attached to what I'm doing."
Yeah, I think that's very true.
That's an important thing, I think.
That's very true. I think one of the things, when you're working with people, our creative writing is started informally. It was a thing we did in the evenings because of student requests, and then it gradually began to dawn on us that we could actually make it part of the degree. But the exciting thing is to be able to show a student what they got on the paper and make them realise that they've got more than they think they have, and that the poem may be different to what they thought they were writing about. That I keep saying to students, don't stop trying to write the poem you thought you were going to write. Listen to what the poem is saying to you.
Yeah.
Listen to what's happening on the page, because it may be a lot more than you think, and than you suspect. And when that happens, that's a thrill.
Aye.
Just
It was
great.
one of the very first things I remember, one of the very first poems I showed to. You know, I can still just about remember when I knew all of my readers personally. But you know, a long time ago, I showed a poem that I'd written to my tutor at university. He read it and said, "This is good. The imagery is strong, and the way you've written here, these line breaks." I think that if you took the last paragraph there of the poem and made that the first paragraph, it would be a much better poem. And my immediate response, "You cannot say that. That's just wrong. I wrote it." Then I thought, wait a minute, stand back, think about it. What's he said? Look at it again, and he's right. And as soon as that switch is thrown,
So things like that. Stop before you think you've finished.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
strike out the last stanza. So, you don't want to tie it up with a bow at the end. It's good.
we're going to draw to an end, and I'm going to. I think we said I'll read one last poem, and then I'll hand over to Rory to conclude the readings of the event. Final opportunity for questions or comments. Are you okay with us to start to wind up now? Okay. All right. We haven't dwelt a great deal. Oh, one thing perhaps just to come back to. When I mentioned our relationship as scholars and academics, and as well as poets, you said it was somehow misunderstood, or sometimes misunderstood, this practice of being.
That's often because people think that it's kind of a contradiction, that creative work and academic work are oxymoron, you know, you can't come together. I find academic work creative, satisfying. Writing a paper, doing a conference, writing an article, engaging with the text, trying to figure out what's in the text and what in the text is speaking to you. I find that creative.
It's good reading. Good reading is good writing. It's the essential thing. Okay, I'll finish with a poem. This is, and again, it picks up on it. It's the idea that the scholarship that we've both done, and that I've done with McDermott.
Just go for that too, but that was amazing. Thank you so much.
With McDermott, resolved itself a couple of years ago now in a sequence of poems, which is a kind of biography in about 30 or 40 poems. So looking at McDermott's life and just dropping in on it here and there. So I'll read the last one from this, called Elegy. And we were both at the funeral, weren't we?
Yeah.
In Langham. We travelled very quickly and suddenly stopped in a world far different from that we had left. In forest glade, in the cemetery, gently, trees breathe and brush, leaves and branches wave. In the grass, an indented rectangle extends from your headstone over your grave. Earth is residual, for better or worse. There's darkness in the soil and patience in the well. Rivers sound their secrets all around us, and above, in the night air, meteors fly. Rory, can you bring us to a conclusion?
Gail mentioned the last poem in this collection. I should say that Gail and Kirsty are astoundingly good editors. My original title for this collection was An Ordinary Day, and they told me that it had to be called The Silver of Old Mirrors. Gosh, they were right. Gosh, they were so right. Anyway, I haven't talked about some of the poems in this collection are to do with dreams. I've been engaged with dream and dreaming as a metaphor, and entering into dreams and classical myth, entering into the underworld, and the dream is a kind of underworld. So it haunts some of these poems, and so this is the last poem in the collection, and it begins with a dream. So it seems like it's called Coda, and if you're wondering if there's a bit of rage, there's a little bit of rage in this poem, and it's about teaching poetry. It's about being an academic and engaging in a classroom and reading poetry aloud. If you're an academic, you've got to hear poetry. You can't teach poetry without the students, without all of us hearing it. It's so crucial. Okay, Coda. It begins, like I say, as a dream. I was talking again last night, discussing poetry and making meaning out of music and music out of meaning, with someone telling me about bowel cancer for some reason, and Francis Bacon and the terror of the flesh. Where did that come from? But it made sense. The words, the dream, the unfolding lines of the poem, and that stillness in the room when words are read aloud and something is conjured up between us all, as the Greeks say, when the god descends. Otherwise we are just stuff.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thanks to Rory for coming. As I say, there are a couple of books available. Happy reading?
Yes.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.